We can't just throw money at every little problem, Maya. My mother's voice came through the phone with that particular tone I'd learned to recognize over 28 years, the one that meant the conversation was already over before it had really begun. I was sitting on my apartment floor, back against the couch because sitting on the couch itself hurt too much. My laptop open in front of me, showing the medical payment portal with its insistent red numbers. $2,000. That's all I needed. $2,000 for the laparoscopic surgery my doctor had been recommending for 6 months. The one that might finally give me relief from the endometriosis that had been steadily turning my life into a careful negotiation between what I needed to do and what my body would allow me to do. I had saved for months, watching my account creep slowly toward that goal. But then Mr. Whiskers had gotten sick, and the emergency vet visit had decimated my surgery fund, and I was left staring at a scheduled surgery date in 3 weeks, with $1,400 in my account and no clear path to closing that gap. So I had done something I almost never did. I had called my parents and asked for help. Not a gift. A loan. I had a repayment plan written out, 12 months of payments, everything documented and formal, because I knew they valued that kind of thing, that kind of responsibility. Mom, it's not a little problem, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even as another wave of pain radiated through my lower abdomen, the kind that made me nauseous and dizzy. It's surgery. My doctor says if I don't get it soon, the scarring could get worse. It's affecting my work. I can barely make it through a full day anymore. There was a pause, and I could hear my father's voice in the background, asking what I wanted now. What I wanted now. As if I called them asking for money every week. As if I hadn't been supporting myself since I was 18, working my way through community college while living in a basement studio that flooded every time it rained. Maya, we simply don't have that kind of money lying around, my mother said. And I almost laughed because I knew that wasn't true. Just last month they'd posted photos from their cruise to Alaska. But more than that, I knew where their money went. I knew about Vanessa's endeavors, my older sister's endless parade of business ventures and artistic pursuits, and finding herself journeys, every one of them funded by our parents' seemingly bottomless well of support. I'm not asking for it as a gift, I said quietly. I have a repayment plan, 12 months. I'll sign whatever you want. Another pause, longer this time, and then my father's voice came on the line, that hearty, confident tone he used when he'd already made a decision and was just waiting for you to accept it. Sweetheart, you're 28 years old. You have a good job. We raised you to be financially responsible. This is part of being an adult. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click. But for me, it means a lot. Financially responsible. I sat there on the floor after they'd said their polite goodbyes and ended the call. Those words echoing in my head until they lost all meaning and just became sounds. And I remembered being 11 years old and asking if I could join the debate team trip to nationals because I'd won the state qualifier, my first real academic achievement that felt important and mine. $300 for the trip, including the hotel and registration, and I'd already planned out how I could babysit Mrs. Chen's kids on weekends to earn half of it if they could just cover the rest. My mother had looked at me with that same tone in her expression, the one that said I was being unreasonable for even asking, and explained that they simply couldn't afford it right now. Money was tight, maybe next year. 2 weeks later, Vanessa came home excited about her new private art instructor, the one who specialized in oil painting and charged $500 a month, and when I did the math later, I realized that over the 5 years Vanessa studied with him, my parents had spent $30,000 on those lessons. Vanessa, who never became an artist, who moved on to other passions and other pursuits, while those canvases sat in our parents' garage gathering dust. I never went to nationals. I told my debate coach I couldn't afford it and watched someone else take my slot. And I learned that wanting things, achieving things, wasn't enough if you were Maya. College was worse. Vanessa got into an out-of-state school with a prestigious art program, tuition running $45,000 a year, and our parents paid every cent of it, all 4 years, plus her apartment and living expenses, and that semester abroad in Florence. $180,000, give or take. I got my acceptance to the same state university Vanessa had turned down with a decent scholarship that would have brought my costs down to maybe $12,000 a year, completely manageable with some loans and part-time work. But when I showed my parents the letter, my father had looked uncomfortable and explained that with Vanessa's tuition they were stretched thin. Maybe I could do community college for a couple years and transfer. So that's what I did. I worked 3 jobs, sometimes 4 during summer, living in that basement studio that smelled like mildew, and taking classes at the community college, then transferring to finish my bachelor's degree online while working full-time as a receptionist at the medical billing office. I still had $18,000 in student loans I was paying off, would be paying off for years still. Vanessa graduated debt-free and spent 6 months backpacking through Southeast Asia to find herself before moving back home to figure out what she really wanted to do. I had learned by then not to ask for help, not to expect it, had learned that being the responsible one meant being responsible for yourself, while Vanessa got to be the one they invested in, believed in, supported through every whim and passion. 2 years ago, when Vanessa announced she was starting her own business, I had actually felt hopeful for her, had wanted to believe that maybe she'd finally found her thing, the purpose that would make all those years of searching make sense. She'd gathered us at our parents' house for brunch, her face glowing with that excitement she got when a new idea seized her and explained her vision for an organic skincare line that would be revolutionary, that would change how women thought about beauty and self-care. She'd done research, she said, had found suppliers, had even sketched out packaging designs, and she just needed startup capital to get it off the ground. $45,000. I watched my parents' faces as she laid out her business plan, such as it was, watched them nod and smile and get caught up in her enthusiasm, and I knew before she even finished talking that they were going to give it to her. And they did. They wrote her a check that same week. $45,000 for inventory and website development and marketing and a rental space in that trendy downtown district where all the boutiques were opening. Vanessa named it Essence, which she said represented getting back to the essence of natural beauty, and for the first few months she was obsessed with it, posting constantly on social media about her products and her vision and the journey of entrepreneurship. She asked me to help out some weekends, just doing inventory and packaging orders, and when I hesitated because weekends were my only time to rest and catch up on everything my week didn't have room for, my mother had called and said it would mean so much to Vanessa, that family supports family, that it was just a few hours here and there, so I did it. I spent my Saturdays in the back room of Essence, packing those little glass jars of face cream and body butter while Vanessa floated around the front talking to the few customers who wandered in. And I never asked for payment because it was understood that you didn't charge family for help, even though Vanessa's business was supposed to be a real business, a professional venture. The skincare line lasted 11 months before Vanessa quietly closed the shop and moved the remaining inventory into our parents' garage, where it probably still sat gathering dust next to those oil paintings. She never said the word bankruptcy, but I overheard my father on the phone with their accountant, talking about write-offs and losses, and I understood that all $45,000 was just gone. Our parents took Vanessa out to dinner to console her, told her that all entrepreneurs fail on their first try, that this was just a learning experience, that they were proud of her for taking the risk. That same month, the check engine light came on in my 10-year-old Honda, and the repair estimate came back at $1,200. I asked my parents if I could borrow it, just until my next paycheck when I could pay them back, because I needed my car to get to work, and I'd already drained my emergency fund, helping with Mr. Whisker's previous vet visit. My father had sighed and said they couldn't keep bailing everyone out, that I needed to figure out my own transportation solutions, maybe take the bus for a while, or look into carpooling. I got a personal loan from my credit union at 18% interest and paid it off over the next year, and I never mentioned it to them again. Vanessa's pivot to her second business happened so quickly after the first failure that I wondered if she'd even pause to process what had gone wrong. But maybe that was unfair of me. Maybe I was just bitter watching her bounce back so effortlessly while I was still paying off that car repair loan. She called it Artisan Home, a boutique specializing in handcrafted home decor that she promised would be different from Essence, more focused, more sustainable, with a real business model this time. She'd found the perfect location in the arts district, she said, a corner space with huge windows and exposed brick, and she'd already connected with local craftspeople who could supply inventory on consignment, which meant lower upfront costs. $38,000, she told our parents over Sunday dinner 6 months after closing Essence, and I watched them exchange one of those looks that meant they were actually considering it, that they were going to say yes again despite everything. My mother had asked a few gentle questions about the business plan, whether Vanessa had consulted with anyone who knew retail, whether she'd looked into the failure rate for boutiques in that area. But Vanessa had answers for everything, confident and bright-eyed in that way that always made our parents believe this time would be different. They wrote her another check, $38,000, and then co-signed a small business loan for an additional $35,000 when Vanessa realized she'd underestimated the renovation costs for the space and needed more inventory than she'd initially planned. $73,000 total, on top of the $45,000 already lost. I was working as a medical billing specialist by then, had finally clawed my way up from receptionist to a position that paid $42,000 a year and came with actual benefits, and I was so careful with my money, budgeting every dollar and building up my emergency fund again and contributing to my retirement account because I knew no one was going to take care of me if I didn't take care of myself. But the endometriosis was getting worse. The pain that had always been bad during my periods was now constant, a deep aching heaviness in my pelvis that some days made it hard to sit at my desk for 8 hours. And the fatigue was overwhelming, this bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could touch. My doctor had been monitoring it for 2 years, trying different treatments and medications, but at my appointment that fall, she finally said what I'd been afraid she'd say, that we needed to do a laparoscopic surgery to remove the endometrial tissue and scar tissue that was causing the pain. $2,000, she said, after insurance, and we should schedule it soon because my condition was affecting my quality of life and potentially my fertility if I ever wanted children. I started saving immediately, putting away every spare dollar, but then Mr. Whiskers got sick again, a urinary blockage that required emergency surgery, and there went $800 of what I'd managed to scrape together, and I was back to square one with the pain getting worse every week. Artisan Home closed after 14 months, quieter than Essence had, with Vanessa just posting a vague Instagram story about needing to step back and reassess her priorities, and I never heard our parents discuss the financial loss, though I knew it had to sting. $73,000 vanished into renovation costs, and unsold inventory and rent on that corner space, with the beautiful windows that I'd helped her paint on 3 separate Saturdays. But 6 months after the boutique closed, Vanessa emerged with new energy and a new vision, announcing over one of our monthly family dinners that she'd discovered her true calling in wellness coaching, that she'd been doing so much personal development work, and people kept telling her she should share her insights professionally, that there was a certification program that would give her the credentials to start her own coaching practice. $32,000, she said, for an intensive training program that included website development and marketing materials and business coaching, everything she'd need to launch properly this time, and I watched my parents' faces for some sign of hesitation, some indication that maybe they'd learned something from the previous failures. But they were nodding along, asking interested questions about her business model and target clients. My mother said something about how Vanessa had always been so intuitive about people, so good at understanding what others needed, and my father agreed that this seemed like a natural fit for her gifts, and within 2 weeks they'd transferred $32,000 into Vanessa's account. I was missing work by then, calling in sick twice in 1 month because the pain was so bad I couldn't stand up straight, couldn't sit in my car for the 20-minute commute without crying, and my supervisor had pulled me aside with concern in her eyes and asked if everything was okay, if there was something going on that I needed to talk about. I downplayed it, said I was dealing with a medical issue, but had it under control. But the truth was, I didn't have it under control at all because I couldn't afford the surgery that would actually help, and the pain medications my doctor prescribed barely took the edge off. Vanessa's wellness coaching business lasted 8 months, and I only knew it had failed because she stopped posting about it on social media and started posting instead about needing to take time for self-care and healing, about how the universe was redirecting her towards something better. She never got a single client, as far as I could tell, never posted a single testimonial or success story, just motivational quotes and photos of her morning coffee and sunset walks. The pain got so bad that winter that I finally broke down and asked my parents for help, called them on a Sunday afternoon when I was alone in my apartment, calculating for the third time whether I could somehow make the numbers work, and I explained about the surgery and the cost and presented them with a written repayment plan, $50 a month for 40 months, everything official and clear, so they'd understand I wasn't asking for a gift, just a loan to get through this medical crisis. My father's voice had been stiff when he said they couldn't just throw money at every problem, that I needed to explore other options, talk to the hospital about payment plans, or look into medical credit cards. And my mother had added that maybe this was a good time for me to learn about financial responsibility, about planning ahead for unexpected expenses, as if I hadn't been planning and budgeting and sacrificing for my entire adult life while they poured money into Vanessa's endless string of failures. I sat on my apartment floor after hanging up the phone, my back against the couch because sitting on the furniture hurt too much, and I pulled out the notebook where I'd been tracking my savings and started doing math that I already knew would break my heart. 45,000 for Essence, the skincare line that lasted less than a year. 38,000 plus the 35,000 loan they'd co-signed for Artisan Home. 73,000 total for the boutique that closed after 14 months. 32,000 for the wellness coaching certification that produced exactly 0 clients. I added it up 3 times because surely I'd made a mistake. Surely the number couldn't be that obscene, but it was right there in black ink, undeniable and devastating. $150,000, give or take, poured into Vanessa's failed dreams over the past 3 years. And I was sitting here unable to come up with $2,000 for a surgery that would let me live without constant pain. $2,000 that I'd offered to pay back, $50 a month for 40 months, everything documented and official, and they'd still said no, had still lectured me about financial responsibility like I was the one who'd burned through enough money to buy a house. The pain in my pelvis was getting worse, that deep grinding ache that made me want to curl into a ball, and I pressed my hand against my lower abdomen as if pressure could somehow help, as if anything could help besides the surgery I couldn't afford. My apartment was small and shabby, a one-bedroom in an older building where the heat was inconsistent and the neighbors were loud. But it was mine, paid for with money I'd earned at a job I'd worked hard to get, and looking around at my thrift store furniture and my carefully budgeted life, I felt something shift inside me, some recognition of just how profoundly unfair this all was. I'd done everything right, everything they'd always told me to do. I'd been responsible and hardworking and independent, had put myself through school and built a career and managed my money carefully, and my reward was to be told I should have planned better, should have saved more, should figure it out on my own. Vanessa had failed 3 times, had lost more money than most people made in 2 years, and her reward was endless patience and understanding and another check whenever she had a new idea. I pulled up Vanessa's Instagram on my phone, scrolled through her recent posts, all sunset photos and inspirational quotes about finding yourself and trusting the journey, and I wondered if she had any idea what it cost. All this finding herself, if she ever thought about the money or just assumed it would always be there because it always had been. I decided then, sitting on my floor with pain radiating through my body and numbers swimming in front of my eyes, that I would figure it out myself because that's what I always did. That's who I'd always been, the one who figured things out while Vanessa figured herself out on someone else's dime. And I felt something hard and hurt taking root in my chest, something that felt like the death of hope I hadn't realized I'd still been holding on to. I picked up extra shifts that week even though every movement felt like broken glass grinding inside me, took on the evening coverage that nobody else wanted because it paid time and a half, and I'd arrive home at 11 at night so exhausted I'd fall asleep in my work clothes on top of the covers. Diane noticed on the third day, caught me gripping the edge of my desk with white knuckles during what I thought was a private moment, and she pulled me into the break room with gentle insistence and asked what was going on, really going on, because she'd worked with me for 2 years and had never seen me like this. I told her everything, the whole pathetic story spilling out in that fluorescent lit room that smelled like burnt coffee and someone's leftover fish, and she listened with her hand on my arm and fury building in her eyes, not at me, but for me, which felt like something I'd been waiting my whole life to experience. She made me promise to let her help somehow, and I promised because it was easier than arguing, though I had no intention of taking anything from her, had learned long ago that I could only count on myself. I started selling things that weekend, posting my laptop on 3 different sites because it was worth maybe $400, and I could use the library computers for anything important, listing the small pieces of jewelry I'd accumulated over the years, including the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me that I knew were worth at least 150. My old textbooks went next, the ones I'd kept thinking maybe I'd reference them someday, then the nice winter coat I'd bought myself 2 years ago as a birthday present. Then the coffee maker that had been a splurge, then the bookshelf my ex-boyfriend had made me that I'd held onto for sentimental reasons that now seemed stupid because sentiment didn't pay for surgery. Each sale felt like cutting away a piece of my life, watching my apartment get emptier and more depressing. But the numbers in my savings account climbed slowly upward, 300, then 500, then 800, and I still needed 600 more with the surgery scheduled in 3 weeks. Vanessa posted photos that week of a spa weekend she'd taken with friends, cucumber slices on her eyes, and champagne in crystal flutes, and a caption about the importance of self-care and treating yourself, and I stared at those images on my phone screen during my lunch break sitting in my car because the break room was too loud and my head was pounding, and I felt something crystallize inside me, some recognition of the injustice that I'd been avoiding my whole life, because acknowledging it meant admitting how profoundly I'd been failed by the people who were supposed to love me most. I wasn't jealous of the spa day, or the champagne, or even the apparent freedom to spend money on treating yourself when you hadn't earned any money in 8 months. I was hurt by the casualness of it, by how easy everything was for her while I was selling my grandmother's earrings to afford medical care, by how completely unaware she seemed to be of any disparity or unfairness, as if the world had simply arranged itself this way naturally, and she was just living in it, blessed and deserving and untouched by the struggle that defined my entire existence. My mother called on a Thursday evening while I was heating up leftover soup and trying to decide if I could afford to refill my pain medication prescription early, and her voice had that bright, artificial quality it always got when she was delivering news that she expected me to receive with enthusiasm I wouldn't feel. "We're having a family dinner this Sunday at 6, she said without preamble, without asking if I had plans or how I was feeling or whether I'd managed to solve the medical crisis they'd refused to help with. "Your father and I want everyone together because Vanessa has some very exciting news to share, and we thought it would be nice to celebrate as a family." The word celebrate hit me wrong, landed in my chest like something heavy and cold, because I couldn't remember the last time they'd wanted to celebrate anything of mine. Couldn't recall a single dinner thrown in honor of my promotion, or my pay raise, or the commendation I'd received from my supervisor for outstanding performance. I don't know if I can make it, I said, the lie feeling necessary, even though we both knew I'd come. Knew I'd always come, because that's what I did. Showed up and smiled and played my role as the dependable daughter who never caused problems. Maya, it's important, my mother said, and I could hear the edge creeping into her voice. That warning tone that meant I was being difficult, was failing to be appropriately grateful for the invitation to watch them fawn over Vanessa again. Vanessa really wants you there, and it's just a few hours. Surely you can manage that. I agreed because arguing took energy I didn't have. Because some part of me that I hated still hoped that maybe this time would be different. That maybe they'd ask how I was doing or notice that I'd lost weight from the pain or show some flicker of interest in my life, and I hung up feeling that familiar dread settling over me like a weighted blanket. The next 3 days I spent preparing myself emotionally, building up my defenses and reminding myself not to expect anything, not to hope for acknowledgement or concern. And I bought a $12 bottle of wine from the discount store, because showing up empty-handed wasn't an option, even though they'd show up empty-handed to my life every single day. I practiced my smile in the bathroom mirror, the one that said everything was fine, and I was happy for whatever success Vanessa was about to announce. And I chose my outfit carefully. The nice sweater that hid how thin I'd gotten, and the pants with the forgiving waistband that wouldn't press against the constant ache in my pelvis. Sunday morning I woke up with pain that made me nauseous, took the maximum dose of over-the-counter medication that barely touched it, and sat on my couch for an hour, talking myself into going, reminding myself that they were still my family, even if they'd failed me, that I still loved them, even if that love was starting to feel like something that only flowed one direction. And I decided I would go, but I would protect myself, would guard my heart, and expect nothing, and survive whatever announcement was coming, because survival was what I did best. I arrived at my parents' house at exactly 6 o'clock, because being late would have been noticed and commented on, would have become evidence of my selfishness or lack of consideration. And I parked behind my father's Mercedes in the circular driveway of the elegant suburban colonial that I'd helped them buy 3 years ago when they'd needed $7,000 for the down payment, and I'd liquidated my entire emergency fund to give it to them. Money I'd never been paid back and had never thought to ask about because that wasn't how our family worked, or at least that wasn't how it worked when I was the one giving. The house looked perfect as always with its manicured lawn and professional landscaping and the expensive wreath on the front door that my mother replaced seasonally, and I grabbed my cheap bottle of wine from the passenger seat and walked up the brick pathway with my practiced smile already in place. That careful expression that said I was fine and happy and not at all in pain that was currently radiating from my pelvis down through my legs. My mother answered the door wearing the cashmere sweater I'd given her for Christmas 2 years ago, one of the few times I'd splurged on something nice for her, and she kissed my cheek with distracted affection before immediately looking past me toward the driveway. "Vanessa's not here yet?" I said, handing her the wine, and my mother glanced at the label with an expression I couldn't quite read before setting it on the hall table without comment. "She texted that she's running a bit behind. You know how she is, always so busy with everything she has going on," my mother said, leading me into the living room where my father sat in his leather recliner, reading something on his tablet. He looked up when I entered, gave me a brief nod and a "Hello, Maya," before returning his attention to his screen, and I sat on the couch that faced away from the window and waited, because that's what I always did. Waited and watched, and tried to take up as little space as possible. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later in a flurry of energy and shopping bags, bursting through the front door calling out greetings, and the entire atmosphere of the house shifted immediately, became brighter and more animated as my parents rushed to greet her like she'd been gone for months instead of just since last weekend. She wore a new outfit that looked expensive, designer jeans and a silk blouse and boots that I recognized from a store window I'd walked past downtown, where everything cost more than my monthly grocery budget. And she dropped her shopping bags in the entryway with careless confidence while hugging our mother and accepting our father's kiss on her forehead. Maya's here too, my mother said, almost as an afterthought, gesturing vaguely in my direction, and Vanessa looked over with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, hey, I didn't see you there," she said, and I stood to hug her briefly, and she smelled like expensive perfume and possibility, like someone who'd never known what it meant to worry about money or worth or whether she mattered. My father was already pouring Vanessa a glass of the Macallan 18-year scotch he kept for special occasions. The bottle that lived in the locked cabinet and cost $140 that I knew because I'd seen it at the liquor store once and had been stunned into silence by the price. "Maya, there's some wine in the kitchen if there's any left from last week," my mother said, not offering to get it, not offering anything at all. And I said I was fine, didn't need anything, and returned to my spot on the couch while they clustered around Vanessa, asking about her drive and her week and whether she was hungry. And I sat there, invisible and aching, and watching the family I'd been born into treat me like a guest they'd forgotten they'd invited. Dinner was served with the kind of ceremony my mother reserved for occasions she deemed important. The good china and cloth napkins and the roast that had been cooking all afternoon filling the house with a smell that might have made me hungry if my stomach wasn't already tight with tension and pain, and we sat at the dining room table with Vanessa at my father's right hand in the position of honor, while I took my usual seat at the far end near the kitchen where I could be useful if anything needed to be fetched. My mother brought out the food with my father's help, while Vanessa sat scrolling through her phone with her scotch, and once we were all settled with full plates, my father cleared his throat in that way that meant something significant was coming, and Vanessa set down her phone with a smile that was equal parts excitement and smugness. "So," she began, and her voice had that breathy quality it always got when she was talking about her latest passion. "I know I've been on a bit of a journey these past few years, trying to find the right path, and I think I've finally discovered my true calling, what I was really meant to do with my life." I cut into my roast beef and chewed slowly while she continued, while my parents leaned forward with matching expressions of interest and encouragement. "I've been doing a lot of soul-searching and personal development work, and I've realized that my gift, my real purpose, is helping other people transform their lives. So I'm starting a holistic life coaching practice focused on helping women find their authentic selves and step into their power." The words sounded like they'd been copied directly from an Instagram post. That particular combination of buzzwords that meant everything and nothing, and I watched my parents nodding along like she'd just announced the cure for cancer. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," my mother said, reaching over to squeeze Vanessa's hand. And my father was already smiling that proud smile I'd seen 1,000 times directed at my sister and almost never at me. "There's this incredible intensive training program in Bali," Vanessa continued, her excitement building. "A 6-week immersive certification retreat with one of the world's leading spiritual life coaches, and it includes accommodations at this beautiful wellness resort and all the materials and the actual certification. And it's a bit of an investment, but it's really the gold standard in the industry." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth because I knew what was coming, could feel it like a weather change. "How much of an investment are we talking about?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral, and Vanessa waved her hand dismissively, like the actual number was irrelevant compared to the opportunity. $28,000, but that includes everything: the training and the resort and the certification and the ongoing mentorship. And honestly, it's a bargain considering what most programs charge. Plus, Mom and Dad have already agreed to cover it because they understand that this is different from the other businesses. This is about helping people and making a real difference. She said it casually, like $28,000 was nothing. Like it was obvious that our parents would fund her fourth business venture after 3 complete failures, and I set my fork down carefully because my hands had started shaking and I didn't trust myself to hold it steady. "When do you leave?" my mother asked, already planning, already organizing her life around Vanessa's dreams. and my sister launched into details about departure dates and what she needed to pack and how transformative it was going to be. And I sat there calculating that $28,000 would have paid for my surgery 14 times over, could have covered my rent for more than a year, represented money I'd never see in one place in my entire life, and they were giving it to her without hesitation, while I sat 5 days away from a surgery I'd sold my belongings to afford, and something inside me that had been cracking for weeks finally split completely open. I waited until Vanessa finished describing the meditation sessions and organic meal plans and sunrise yoga classes that were included in the $28,000 package, waited until my mother asked about the resort's amenities, and my father mentioned something about what a worthwhile investment this would be in her future. And then I set down my water glass and said quietly, "My surgery is scheduled for next Tuesday." And the words fell into the conversation like stones into still water. My mother's head turned toward me with an expression of vague surprise, as if she'd genuinely forgotten I was sitting there, and she said, "Oh, you found the money then?" With a tone that suggested mild curiosity rather than any real concern about how I'd managed to scrape together $2,000 for a medically necessary procedure. I folded my napkin carefully in my lap and said, "I've been working double shifts for the past 6 weeks. I sold my laptop and my grandmother's jewelry and all my textbooks from college. And I'm on a payment plan with the hospital for the remaining $600 that I'll be paying off for the next 8 months at $75 a month." And I recited these facts in the same level tone I used at work when explaining billing procedures to patients, because if I let any emotion into my voice, I knew I would start crying and I couldn't let that happen. Vanessa took a sip of her expensive scotch and said, "See, Mom? I told you Maya always figures it out. She's so resourceful. She doesn't really need help like some of us do." And she said it like it was a compliment, like my ability to survive without support was something to admire rather than a consequence of being systematically denied the help that was freely given to her. My father nodded as if Vanessa had said something profound and added, "Exactly why we focus our resources where they're really needed. Maya's always been the independent one, the responsible one. She doesn't need us bankrolling her the way some people do." And he meant it as praise. I could hear that in his voice. He genuinely believed he was complimenting me by explaining why my sister's fourth failed business venture deserved $28,000, while my surgery had deserved nothing but a lecture about fiscal responsibility. I looked at my plate where the food had gone cold, at the expensive roast and the organic vegetables from the farmer's market, and the homemade rolls that my mother only made for special occasions, and I thought about how I'd been eating rice and beans for 6 weeks to save money while Vanessa was taking weekend spa trips and buying designer boots and planning a 6-week retreat in Bali. And something that had been holding itself together inside me with tape and willpower and a lifetime of lowered expectations finally came apart completely. And when I looked up at my parents, I saw them clearly for perhaps the first time in my life, saw them not as I'd always wanted them to be, but as they actually were. And the clarity of it was both devastating and strangely liberating. I heard my own voice say, "Why is Vanessa's fourth business attempt more important than my health?" And the question came out quieter than I'd intended, but clear enough that everyone at the table heard it. Clear enough that my mother's hand froze halfway to her wine glass, and my father's fork clattered against his plate, and Vanessa's eyes went wide with something that might have been surprise or might have been irritation. The silence that followed felt like it had weight and texture, like something I could reach out and touch. And I watched my parents exchange one of those looks that married people develop over decades, that wordless communication that meant they were deciding together how to handle this unexpected challenge to the established order. My mother recovered first, setting down her wine glass with careful precision and turning to me with an expression that I recognized from childhood, the one she used when I'd done something she considered inappropriate or embarrassing, and she said, "Maya, I don't appreciate your tone right now, and frankly, this jealousy is very unbecoming." And the word jealousy landed like an accusation, like my question had revealed some character flaw, rather than a legitimate concern about the staggering disparity in how they treated their daughters. I felt my hands start to shake, so I pressed them flat against my thighs under the table where no one could see them, and I said with my voice trembling but still functioning, "It's not jealousy, it's confusion, because I genuinely don't understand how you can give Vanessa $28,000 for a training program in Bali, when 3 weeks ago you told me you couldn't help with $2,000 for surgery that my doctor says I need." And saying it out loud, articulating the contradiction in clear terms, made it somehow more real and more painful at the same time. My father leaned back in his chair with that particular expression he got when he was about to explain something he thought should be obvious, and he said, "Maya, these are completely different situations. Vanessa is investing in her future and her career development, whereas your surgery is a personal medical issue that insurance is covering most of anyway." And the logic of it was so twisted, so fundamentally wrong, that I almost laughed, except nothing about this was actually funny. Vanessa rolled her eyes in that dramatic way she'd perfected as a teenager and never outgrown, and she said, "Here we go, the martyr routine. Maya always has to make everything about her and her problems." And her voice had that edge of performative exasperation, like I was the difficult one, like I was the one who'd spent the last decade taking and taking and taking without ever giving anything back. I looked at my sister across the table, and I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue, all the times I'd congratulated her on new ventures I knew would fail, all the times I'd smiled and supported and pretended not to notice that everything in our family revolved around her needs and her dreams and her feelings while mine were treated as inconvenient background noise. And I felt something shift inside me, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves into a new and permanent configuration. And I knew with absolute certainty that I was about to say things that couldn't be unsaid, about to cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. And the strange thing was that I didn't care anymore, didn't care about keeping the peace or being the easy daughter or maintaining the fiction that our family was functional and fair. I started talking, and once I started, I couldn't seem to stop. And I heard myself saying, "Let me make sure I understand the math here, because I've actually been keeping track." And I pulled out my phone with hands that were steadier than I expected, and opened the Notes app where I'd been documenting everything for the past 3 years. Every dollar amount, and every denial, and every casual dismissal. Vanessa's organic skincare line, $45,000 that you gave her in June 2 years ago, and that business lasted 11 months before she declared bankruptcy. And that same summer, I asked for $1,200 to fix my car's transmission so I could get to work, and you told me I needed to learn to handle my own expenses. And my voice was gaining strength as I spoke, losing the tremor it had started with, and I scrolled through my notes while my parents stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Then there was the artisanal home decor boutique, $38,000 in direct investment, plus you co-signed a $35,000 loan that she defaulted on, so you paid that too, which brings that venture to $73,000 total. And that business lasted what, 9 months before the inventory got sold off for pennies on the dollar. And I looked up from my phone to see my mother's face had gone pale, and my father was shaking his head like I was saying something inappropriate, like I was the one being unreasonable by remembering. And then the wellness coaching certification, $32,000 for training that never led to a single paying client, website design that's now defunct, marketing materials that are in a box in your garage. And that was 8 months of Vanessa finding herself while I was working overtime, with endometrial tissue growing where it shouldn't, and making every day feel like someone was stabbing me from the inside. And I could hear my voice getting louder, but I couldn't seem to modulate it anymore. Couldn't seem to access the self-control that had kept me quiet and compliant for 28 years. My father tried to interrupt, saying, "Maya, this isn't about keeping score." But I held up my hand and kept going. "That's $150,000, Dad." I added it up. $150,000 for 3 failed businesses, and now you're about to hand over 28,000 more for what will obviously be a fourth failure, because Vanessa has never finished anything she started, and you both know it, even if you won't admit it. And Vanessa made an outraged sound and pushed back from the table. but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And when I asked for $2,000, not even a gift, but a loan with a written repayment plan and interest if you wanted it, $2,000 for surgery that my doctor says is medically necessary, you told me you couldn't just throw money at every little problem and that I needed to be more financially responsible. And I felt tears starting, but I blinked them back because I needed to finish this. Needed to say everything that had been building inside me like pressure in a sealed container. My mother found her voice and said, "These situations are completely different. Vanessa has an entrepreneurial spirit that needs nurturing. She's an artist. She's creative. She needs support to find her path." And the way she said it, like Vanessa's repeated failures were somehow more valuable than my consistent success, like dreaming was more important than surviving, made something break loose in my chest. I looked at my mother and saw in her face something I recognized from every significant moment of my childhood, that particular expression of disappointment mixed with irritation that she reserved specifically for me, and she said with her voice cutting through the dining room like a blade, "Honestly, Maya, you're being selfish." And the word selfish landed in the center of my chest like a physical blow, like something with weight and edges that could bruise. The word selfish after I'd spent my entire life being the easy daughter, the one who didn't ask for things, the one who worked 3 jobs through college while Vanessa got her full ride to her dream school, the one who showed up to every family event with a smile and a hostess gift and never mentioned that I was drowning in student loan debt, that they could have prevented with a fraction of what they'd spent on my sister's fantasies. The word selfish, after I'd sold my laptop and my grandmother's jewelry and worked overtime shifts that made my endometriosis flare so badly I sometimes had to pull over on the drive home to vomit from the pain, all so I wouldn't burden them with my needs. And I felt something crystallize in that moment, some final understanding clicking into place like a lock mechanism finding its position. My father nodded in agreement with my mother and added, "We raised you to be independent and self-sufficient, and this kind of scorekeeping and resentment is frankly beneath you." And I noticed he didn't deny any of the numbers I'd cited, didn't dispute the $150,000, just reframed my accurate accounting as a character flaw, as evidence that something was wrong with me rather than with the system that had starved me while gorging my sister. Vanessa seized the moment like she always did, like she'd been trained to do by a lifetime of having her parents' automatic support, and she said with her voice dripping with theatrical exasperation, "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Maya always making everything about her, always playing the victim, always acting like the world owes her something." And the projection of it was so complete, so utterly without self-awareness, that I felt almost dizzy trying to comprehend how she could say those words without choking on them. I sat there looking at the 3 of them, my mother with her pinched expression of moral superiority, my father with his disappointed frown, my sister with her eye roll and her dismissive hand gesture, and I understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that they would never see it, would never acknowledge the staggering inequality of how they'd treated us, would never admit that they'd systematically invested in Vanessa's potential while expecting me to simply survive on competence and willpower. The realization wasn't even painful anymore. It was just factual, just true in the way that gravity is true, and I felt my breathing slow and my hands stop shaking, and something like calm settle over me. The calm that comes when you finally stop fighting against reality and accept what is. I stood up from the table, and my chair made a scraping sound against their hardwood floor that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. And I said with a voice that sounded calm and clear and almost like it belonged to someone else, "I'm done." And my mother looked confused and said, "Done with dinner?" Like she thought I was just commenting on the meal. And I shook my head and said, "Done with this, with all of it. With seeking your approval or your support or your acknowledgement that I matter as much as Vanessa does." And I watched my father's face register shock, because in 28 years I had never pushed back, had never contradicted them, had never been anything but accommodating and understanding and willing to accept whatever crumbs of attention they threw my way. I'm having surgery next Tuesday, and I'll handle it myself the way I handle everything myself. I've sold my laptop and my grandmother's earrings, and I'm working a payment plan with the hospital for the remaining balance. And I'll recover in my apartment alone and go back to work when I'm healed enough, and you don't need to worry about it, or think about it, or feel guilty about it, because clearly you won't. And I heard the words coming out without bitterness, without anger, just with a kind of factual sadness that felt more honest than any emotion I'd performed for them over the years. My mother reached out like she was going to touch my arm and said, "Maya, you're being ridiculous. Sit down and let's discuss this rationally." And I stepped back from her reach and said, "There's nothing to discuss. I just needed to say it out loud so I could hear it myself. That you will never see me the way you see her, that I will never be worth investing in no matter what I achieve or how much I struggle. And that's fine. That's your choice. But it's also my choice to stop expecting anything different." My father stood up, and his voice had that edge of parental authority that had always made me comply before, and he said, "You're upset, and you're not thinking clearly. Nobody's saying you don't matter." But I met his eyes and said, "You're not saying it with words, Dad. You're saying it with $150,000 in one direction and zero in the other. You're saying it every time you tell me I'm independent like it's a compliment, when what you really mean is that I'm convenient because I don't need anything from you." Vanessa laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Oh my God, this is so dramatic. You're really going to storm out over nothing?" And I looked at her and felt something like pity, because she genuinely believed this was nothing, genuinely couldn't see the cruelty in the casual dismissal of my pain. I picked up my purse from the chair where I'd set it hours ago when I'd arrived hoping for a pleasant evening, and I walked toward the front door while my mother called after me saying, "Maya, don't leave like this, don't be childish." And I turned back one last time and said, "I love you all, but I can't keep breaking myself against your indifference." And then I walked out into the cool October evening and closed the door behind me with a quiet click that felt like the most decisive action I'd ever taken. I made it to my car before the tears started, and I sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and the engine off in my parents' driveway with their porch light illuminating the dashboard, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child, with my whole body shaking and my breath coming in gasps that hurt my chest. And it wasn't just about the surgery or the money anymore. It was about 28 years of feeling like I was performing for an audience that would never applaud, like I was taking a test that had no passing grade. I drove home slowly and carefully because my vision kept blurring and I had to keep wiping my eyes. And when I got to my apartment, it felt both like a sanctuary and like the loneliest place in the world. This small one-bedroom space that I'd furnished entirely from IKEA and estate sales because that's what I could afford. And I sat on my second-hand couch and felt the weight of what I'd just done settle over me like a heavy blanket. I picked up my phone and stared at it for a long time before I finally opened my texts and wrote to Diane, my coworker who'd been asking about my surgery plans and who'd noticed when I came back from lunch breaks with my jaw clenched against pain. And I typed out the whole story in a long, rambling message that probably didn't make complete sense, but that I needed to send to someone who might understand. Her response came back within 3 minutes, and it just said, "I'm coming over." And before I could tell her not to bother, she was calling me, and her voice was warm and indignant on my behalf, in a way that made me start crying again. And she said, "Maya, listen to me. You need to check your email. Check it right now." And I pulled my laptop up even though I'd been planning to sell it, and I logged into my work email with shaking hands. There was a message from Diane with the subject line, "From your work family." And when I opened it, I saw a list of names, almost everyone from our department and several people from other departments, and next to each name was a dollar amount. $20 here, $50 there, and at the bottom it said, total $800. And there was a note that said, "We all see how hard you work and how much you've been struggling, and we wanted to help because that's what family does." I sat there staring at the screen and reading the names over and over. People I had coffee with in the break room, and people I'd trained and people who'd trained me, people who'd noticed when my parents and sister never had. And Diane was talking on the phone saying, "And Rachel talked to Mr. Peterson, and he's adding 400 from his own pocket, and he said to take the whole week after surgery as paid leave. He's not counting it against your PTO." And I couldn't speak because my throat was closed with emotion, but this time it wasn't grief. It was something else entirely. I managed to whisper, "Why would you all do this?" And Diane's response was immediate and firm. "Because you matter, Maya. Because you show up every day and you help everyone else and you never complain, and you deserve people who show up for you too." And I realized that I'd been looking for family in the wrong place all along. That family wasn't just the people who shared your DNA, but the people who saw your worth and chose to honor it. The surgery was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 7, and Diane picked me up at 5:30 because I wasn't allowed to drive myself home after anesthesia. And sitting in her passenger seat in the pre-dawn darkness, I felt a strange mixture of terror about the medical procedure and profound gratitude that I wasn't facing this alone the way I'd thought I would be. The hospital was cold and bright and smelled like disinfectant, and I changed into the thin gown they gave me and waited on the gurney while nurses checked my vitals and asked me the same questions over and over about allergies and medications. And the anesthesiologist had kind eyes and told me I'd feel a slight pinch, and then I'd wake up and it would all be over. And those were the last words I heard before the world went soft and dark. I woke up in recovery with a different kind of pain than I'd been living with. This pain sharp and localized, and somehow cleaner than the chronic ache that had been my constant companion. And a nurse told me the surgery had gone well, and they'd found significant endometrioal tissue growth that they'd removed, and my doctor would talk to me more when I was fully awake. Diane was there when they wheeled me to the discharge area, and she'd brought my softest pajama pants and a loose sweater, and she helped me get dressed while I was still foggy and clumsy from the anesthesia, and she drove me home and helped me up the stairs to my apartment and settled me on my couch with pillows and blankets and a cup of tea. My phone had a single text message from my mother that just said, "Hope you're okay," with no question mark, no follow-up offer to visit or help. Just a statement that felt like the bare minimum obligation discharged, and there was nothing from Vanessa at all, not a word. And I stared at that silence and felt both hurt and somehow freed by the clarity of exactly where I stood in their priorities. The first 3 days were hard with the surgical pain and the grogginess from pain medication and the frustration of needing help with basic tasks. But Diane came by every evening after work, and Rachel from accounting brought me homemade soup, and even Mr. Peterson called to check on me and tell me not to worry about anything at the office. And I realized I was surrounded by care from people who barely knew my story, but who showed up anyway. By the end of the first week, I could move around more easily, and the pain was manageable, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt hope that my body might actually heal, that I might be able to live without that constant grinding ache that had colored everything. My parents called once during the second week, and my mother asked how I was feeling in that bright, false voice she used when she was uncomfortable, and I gave brief answers and didn't elaborate and let the silence stretch until she said she had to go, and I didn't feel guilty about the distance. I just felt tired. 3 weeks after the surgery, I went back to work wearing comfortable clothes and moving carefully, but feeling genuinely better than I had in years, and my coworkers welcomed me back like I'd returned from a long journey, and I sat at my desk and looked at the small plant Rachel had left there with a note that said, "Welcome back, we missed you." And I understood that I'd been building a real life here all along while I'd been grieving the family life I'd never actually had. 2 months after my surgery, I was thriving in a way I hadn't thought possible, the chronic pain that had shadowed my every movement finally gone, and my work performance improving so dramatically that Mr. Peterson promoted me to senior specialist, with a salary increase that felt like validation of every extra shift and every careful budget decision I'd ever made. I was at my desk on a Thursday afternoon, reviewing a complex billing case, when my phone buzzed with a text from my building's front desk saying I had visitors. and my stomach dropped because I hadn't been expecting anyone. And the only people who would show up unannounced were my parents. And I considered asking the desk to tell them I wasn't home, but something made me respond that I'd be down in 5 minutes. They were standing in my building's small lobby, looking out of place in their expensive casual clothes, my father in his golf polo, and my mother in her carefully coordinated athleisure outfit. And their faces had an expression I'd seen before when Vanessa's businesses failed, this mixture of worry and exhaustion and desperate hope that someone could fix things. My mother hugged me in that performative way she had, holding me at arm's length first, and looking me over like she was inspecting a purchase. And my father nodded and said I looked well, and there was an awkward silence before I asked if they wanted to come up to my apartment, even though I didn't really want them in my space. We sat in my small living room with them on the couch that my coworkers had helped me pick out, and me in the chair across from them. And my mother kept looking around at my modest furniture and my IKEA shelves and my small kitchen visible through the doorway, and I could see her cataloging everything and finding it wanting the way she always had. My father cleared his throat in that way that meant he was about to say something difficult, and he started with, "We have some news about Vanessa." And my first thought was that she was sick or hurt, but then my mother jumped in with, "The Bali training program was a scam, Maya. The whole thing was fraudulent and the money is just gone. All $28,000. And she said it like this was a tragedy that had befallen them, rather than a predictable consequence of sending Vanessa across the world for a certification program they'd never properly researched. I sat there processing this information and thinking about how I'd spent weeks selling my belongings and working extra shifts for $2,000 while they'd casually handed over $28,000 for something that sounded suspicious from the start, and my father continued, "She's devastated, absolutely heartbroken, and she's moving back home because she can't afford her apartment anymore and she's very depressed." And there was a pause where they both looked at me expectantly. My mother leaned forward and said, "We thought maybe you could talk to her, help her through this. You understand what it's like to struggle and fail, and have to start over." And those words hung in the air between us like a physical thing. This casual equation of my survival against impossible odds with Vanessa's pattern of expensive failures cushioned by their endless support, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger exactly, but a kind of amazed disbelief at the audacity of their request. I looked at my mother with her expectant expression, and my father with his uncomfortable shifting, and I felt something crystallize inside me, a clarity that cut through all the years of confusion and self-doubt, and I said quietly, "I've never failed, Mom, because I was never given the chance to try anything that had the luxury of failure attached to it." They both blinked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language, and my mother started to say something, but I continued, my voice steady and calm in a way that surprised me. "Vanessa has failed 4 times now because you gave her $150,000 to experiment with her dreams, to try and fail and try again, and every time she fell, you were there to catch her and fund the next attempt. But I've succeeded at everything I've ever done because I had no choice, because there was no safety net, because my survival depended on getting it right the first time." My father's face was reddening, and he opened his mouth, but I wasn't done. I was just getting started after 28 years of swallowing words. I succeeded at community college while working 3 jobs because I had to. I succeeded at keeping my car running and my rent paid and my bills current because failure meant homelessness. I succeeded at my career because I needed health insurance and stability. And I succeeded at getting my surgery handled because the alternative was living in chronic pain for the rest of my life. So no, I can't relate to Vanessa's experience of failure because our experiences aren't even in the same universe. The silence in my small apartment was thick and heavy, and my mother's eyes were wide, and my father was gripping his knees with both hands. And then my mother cleared her throat and said in a smaller voice, "Well, that's actually part of why we came. We wanted to ask if you might be able to help Vanessa financially, just temporarily, maybe $5,000 to help her get back on her feet and start fresh." I stared at them both, and something bubbled up in my chest and came out as laughter, real genuine laughter that I couldn't control. and I laughed until tears ran down my face, while my parents watched with expressions of confusion and hurt. When I finally caught my breath, I said, "You're asking me, the daughter you wouldn't loan $2,000 for surgery, to give Vanessa $5,000 for her fifth business attempt?" My father straightened and said, "It's not for a business. It's to help her rebuild her confidence, maybe take some legitimate courses, and we'd pay you back, of course." And I shook my head slowly and said the word that I should have learned to say decades ago: no. The word felt powerful and clean and final, and my mother's face crumpled in that way it did when she wasn't getting what she wanted, and she said, "Maya, she's your sister. Family helps family." And I stood up from my chair and said, "Family does help family. You're right." Which is why it's so interesting that my coworkers contributed more to my surgery than my own parents did. My father stood too, and his voice had that edge it got when his authority was questioned, and he said, "We raised you better than this, Maya. We raised you to be generous and compassionate." And I walked to my apartment door and opened it and said, "No, you raised me to be invisible and self-sufficient, so I wouldn't inconvenience you. And I'm finally accepting that lesson." 6 months after that confrontation in my apartment, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined when I was lying awake at night trying to figure out how to afford surgery, because I'd been promoted again and was now leading the entire medical billing department with a salary that felt almost surreal after years of careful budgeting. And I was dating Marcus, Diane's younger brother, who had come to pick her up from work one evening and stayed to talk to me for 2 hours in the parking lot about everything from healthcare policy to our favorite restaurants. My apartment was still small, but I'd furnished it properly now with a comfortable couch I'd chosen myself and artwork on the walls that I actually loved. And every morning I woke up without pain, felt like a gift I'd given myself through sheer determination and the support of people who had chosen to care about me. My parents called occasionally with updates I hadn't asked for about Vanessa's job search, or requests to have lunch sometime and talk, that I politely declined, and I'd changed their ringtone to silent so their calls wouldn't jar me out of whatever peaceful moment I was experiencing. I had dinner at Diane's house every other Sunday, where her whole family treated me like I'd always belonged there, and Marcus's nieces called me Aunt Maya, and nobody kept score of who needed what or measured love by dollar amounts. Then one evening, I was leaving work and checked my phone to find a voicemail from Vanessa, her first direct contact in half a year, and her voice was tight with anger as she said, "I can't believe you've completely abandoned your family, Maya. Mom and Dad are hurt and confused, and I'm struggling, and you just don't care. You've always been selfish, but this is a new low. Don't bother calling back unless you're ready to apologize and actually act like a sister for once." I stood in the parking lot listening to her words and felt nothing except a distant sadness for the family we might have been if things had been different, if my worth had ever been measured by who I was rather than how little I demanded. I deleted the voicemail and drove to Marcus's place where we'd planned to cook dinner together. And as I stood in his kitchen chopping vegetables while he told me about his day teaching high school history, I realized that I'd spent 28 years trying to earn something that was never going to be given freely, trying to prove I deserved the same consideration and support that Vanessa received simply for existing. The real revelation wasn't that my parents had failed me or that Vanessa had been thoughtlessly cruel. It was that I had never been the problem, had never been less than or unworthy or selfish, and my value as a person had never been determined by their recognition of it. At work the next day, I sat in my new office with its window overlooking the city, my body free from the chronic pain that had shadowed my every movement, surrounded by colleagues who respected my expertise and judgment, and I thought about how real family wasn't necessarily the people you were born to, but the people who showed up when you needed them, who celebrated your successes without resentment, who measured your worth by your character rather than your compliance. I'd built a life that was entirely my own through necessity and determination, and the peace I felt now was hard-won and precious and mine, and nobody could take it from me because I'd finally learned the lesson that had eluded me for so long. I was enough, exactly as I was, and I always had been.